today for Real Estate, Religion, and You. My name is Dr. Sylvia Black, licensed real estate broker with affordable homes and apartments. I'm licensed to preach and ordained as a minister, and I have my PhD in sacred biblical studies. And I'd like to thank you for joining me today for Real Estate, Religion, and You. And my name is Dr. Today I'd like to talk to you on a continued basis of my book, The Champion in You, Win the Battle and the War Against Your Giants. Win the battle and the war against your giants. And this book will be available on Books Galore and more. Also, it may be available on www.lulu.com. That's lulu.com. But it may be only available directly through my website at booksgaloreandmore.com. And you can also hit me up on Facebook, Dr. Sylvia Black. You can visit my YouTube addresses at sblack3001, Highway to Heaven Church, Affordable Homes and Apartments. Okay, and I want to thank you for joining me today for Real Estate, Religion, and You. You can also visit Craigslist for ads that I have advertising my books on Craigslist. Now today's topic, we're going to talk about one enemy that David did not defeat. And if you can guess what that is, holler at the sister before you hear the message. Of course, it'll probably be too late by then. Okay, now one enemy David did not defeat. Now throughout David's battles, he still had one battle that he could not win. The battle defeated him, okay? It was the battle of love. Okay, how many of y'all guilty of that, okay? The battle of crucifying his flesh. Now when David saw Bathsheba, all the rules were broken. Everything was out the window. David was king. He could do what he wanted to do, right? After all, look at the people that David slayed, all the territories David conquered, all of David's warriors that fought and won, battle after battle. I'm sure a lot of us like David in a sense, are like him. David can kill lions and bears with his bare hands. David can slay a giant with a smooth stone and a slingshot. David can defeat army after army on the battlefield, even when it looked like he was outnumbered. But when it comes to matters of the heart, that battle defeated David. Okay, he was outnumbered in that battle, and he lost his firstborn son as a result of his actions. Until you have walked a mile in someone else's shoes, you should not judge. The Bible says, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." However, when David saw Bathsheba, you can say he lost his mind. How can a man who was so forthright not have any idea of what he was doing? Committing adultery in broad daylight, having a man killed because that man would not go home and sleep with his own wife. It wasn't until the prophet came to David and told him a story for which he said, "You are that man." Have you ever been there? You being so overwhelmed that with your flesh that you forget about God? I haven't. I have had lots of experience crucifying my flesh, and I'm not about to act impulsively knowing that it could get me in trouble and separate me from God's love. No, I'm not perfect, but I know when to crucify my flesh and when not to. Okay? I take nothing for granted. Okay? When you get to the point that you cannot control your own flesh, you are asking for trouble. When you give in to the desires of your flesh, you're putting God second. And God should always be first. Okay? We should not get to the point where our flesh can control us and then inevitably end up sending you to hell. Plus, when you lie once, now you got to keep on lying to cover up the previous lie. One lie leads to another, and the next thing you know, you're even lying to yourself. You know, they may ask you, "Where were you last night?" "Oh, I was hanging out with friends." "Well, I called your friend and he said he wasn't with you. So where were you?" You know, and now you're going to have to think of another lie, and eventually you'll be lying to yourself. You won't be able to separate the truth from lies after a while. Now, when you give in to the desires of your flesh, you are committing idolatry, in addition to adultery, of course. Well, no, adultery is only when you're married, you're having sex with someone who's married. But you're committing idolatry when you give into the flesh. And that's a sin. Why would that be considered idolatry? Because if you can't control your flesh, okay, I'm going to tell you right here. The Bible says that thou shalt have no other gods before me. That includes your flesh. If your flesh controls you, then that means that it's your God. You do what it tells you to do when it tells you to do it. Okay? When you give in to the desires of your flesh, you're being selfish and only thinking about yourself. What about your children? What about your spouse? Okay, they may have to pay, not for your sins, but now they will have to struggle with sin because you've sinned. Okay, and you know what happened with, look at what happened with David's firstborn. David didn't even give his firstborn a chance to live his own life because David's sin caused his son's death. Okay, there is spiritual death and there is physical death. First you die spiritually, then you are being prepared for hell's kingdom unless you turn your life around. Okay, then you may die physically and then you end up going to hell if you still continue on that same path. Now, even though David did sin, once he was made aware of his actions, he dedicated the rest of his life to God and sinned no more. Let us take a look at the story of Bathsheba and David and find out exactly how they met. Okay. Now, 2 Samuel 11 says, in the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelites' army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, when he was after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace, and he looked out over the city and noticed a woman of unusual beauty. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and they told him that she was Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. And David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to him to the palace, he slept with her. She had just contemplated the purification rites after having her menstrual period, and then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered she was pregnant, she sent David a message, "I'm pregnant." Then David sent word to Joab, Send me Uriah the Hittite. Okay. When David asked Uriah how Joab and the army were getting along, when David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing, then he told Uriah, "Go home and relax." David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah did not go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guards. When David heard that Uriah had not gone home, he summoned him and asked, "What's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long?" And Uriah replied, "The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and the master's men are camping in open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing." "Well, stay here today," David said, "and tomorrow you may return to the army." So Uriah stayed at Jerusalem that day and the next day and the next. And then David invited him to dinner and he got drunk, but even then he couldn't get Uriah to go home. Again, he slept at the palace entrance in the king's palace guard. So now David has arranged Uriah's death, which in today's world can be classified as premeditated murder. Okay, so the next morning David wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to deliver. The letter instructed Joab, station Uriah in the front of the lines where the battle is fear cast. Then pull back so that he will be killed. So Joab assigned Uriah to a spot close to the city wall where he knew the enemy's strongest men are fighting. And then the enemy soldiers came out of the city to fight. Uriah the Hittite was killed along with several other Israelite soldiers. Okay, then Joab sent a battle report to David. He's told his messenger report all the news of the battle to the king. Okay, but he might get angry and ask, why did the troops get so close to the city? Didn't they know they would be shooting from the walls? Wasn't Abimelech, son of Gideon, killed in Thebaz, who threw a milestone down on him and from the wall? Why would you get so close to the wall? Then tell him Uriah the Hittite was killed too. So the messenger went to Jerusalem and gave the complete report to David. The enemy came out against us in the open fields, he said, and as we charged them back to the city gate, the archers on the wall shot arrows at us. Some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite. Well then, Joab, not to be discouraged, David said, the sword devours this one day, and that one tomorrow. Fight harder next time and conquer the city. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done. This is what I meant when I said earlier that you will, when you sin, when you don't crucify your flesh, you're being selfish. Okay, you're only thinking of yourself. Okay, when you sin, now your children will have to suffer with sin, not because of your sin. They're not going to pay the price for what you did, but now they're going to have to struggle with sin. In another book, I call it the legacy of mercy, I believe. The legacy of mercy, or the legacy of blessing. I think it's the legacy of mercy, where it talks about if you live your life upright, okay, honestly, as best you can, if you have a clean heart, pure heart after God, and you have children, your children are not going to see you sinning. They're not going to know anything about sin when you think about it logically. So therefore, if I don't know anything about sinning, if all I see you doing is going to church, praising God and whatnot, but yet you go to school and you see all these different things going on in school, but when I come home, I see my mom and my daddy going to church. I see, the whole family praying and talking about the goodness of the Lord. And this is the example that the child will have to live by, regardless of what's going on out in the street. If your family has a strong bond within them, okay, you don't have to worry about your child following after Sally Schmo in the gang or whatever on school, or playing hooky from school or what have you, because they're going to see that you are living your life right before the Lord. So if you don't sin as a parent, your child will not have to suffer with sin. Okay, if you look at some of the examples in the Bible talks about some of those examples of the parent who lived righteous and the children who were born into righteousness, and then there were other children who were born into unrighteousness because their parents sinned, and then now they had to struggle with sin. You see, now sin is going to be presented before them. Now they're going to be tempted. They see you smoking a cigarette or a joint or whatever, they're going to want to smoke a joint. They see you drinking, they're going to want to drink. Okay, this one thing leads to the other. So now they're going to have to struggle with sin because you sinned. They're going to have to deal with their own sin. They're going to have to answer to God for their own mistakes. But because you as the parent gave a poor example for your children, whether they saw you sitting there in that living room drinking or not, God knows the hearts of us all. And so you go and now you start sinning, and God is displeased with that, as he said with David. So now your child is going to have to suffer with sin. And they're going to have to make a decision for themselves as to whether they're going to serve God or not. Of course, hopefully they will decide to serve God. But now they are going to have to deal with that. And it could be a possibility that they may not get saved. That's why a lot of children are getting killed today, because their parents are not living up right. And I don't want to blame it on the parents, but it's true. You see a lot of children that are out of control today. It starts at home, baby. It starts at home. You have to develop a strong bond. Communication goes a long way. Okay, are you a friend to your child as well as a parent? Are you always telling your child to shut up, sit down, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, leave me alone? And then when you take the child everywhere with you and then you sit down and you don't say nothing to the child. Child comes home from school, you don't even ask him, how was your day? You don't treat your child like a human being, but you're always telling them to stop doing this, stop doing that. You know what I mean? You don't have any communication with your child. Your child can't trust you with any information that they want to tell you. So they go out and they act it. They can trust the people out in the streets better than they can trust you, because you're always giving them orders and telling them what to do, but you're not communicating with them, and you're not being a friend as well as a parent. Oh, some people say, well, I ain't no friend. I'm a parent. I run this house. It's my house. But they're human. Children are human too. And if you want this world to be a better place to live in, then the children are going to grow up and be leaders now. They're going to have, they're the ones, when they get grown, it's up to them now. So, okay, now they're going to have children to raise, and they're going to have to deal with the stuff that goes on in society. Or whatever. They're going to have to get a job. You know, are they going to be able to get a stable job? Are they going to be a stable individual? Or are they going to become a murderer or a rapist or something? And because of the way you raise them. It starts at home. It starts with where the parents raise them, whether they're being raised by one parent or two parents. And I strongly agree with that. Because like I said, the first 4 years of my life were the best 4 years of my life because I had a stable upbringing at that point. It was at 4 years old, then I had to go back home and live with my biological mother. But the first 4 years of my life was stabilized. As a result of that. I didn't turn out to be a murderer or rapist or killer. You know, so I, was able to think sensibly and whatnot. I still had to struggle with sin because my mother sinned. So I had to struggle with sin, not because I saw her sinning, but just God, that's just the curse that God imposes upon the family. When you sin, now your children have to struggle with their own sin. I'm not going to pay the price for my mama's sin. I'm not going to go to hell because of what my mama or my daddy did. But I am going to have to struggle with sin, and I'm going to have to find my own way in this sinful world. Okay? Now, David confesses his guilt. Okay? Okay? David confesses his guilt. Okay, to Nathan. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replied, yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for your sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of the Lord by doing this, your child will die. After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child, and David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child, but he went without food all day and all night. He was fasting. Okay, and on the bare ground, with the elders of the household pleaded with him to get up and go eat something, but he refused. Then on the seventh day, the child died, just as Nathan had predicted, and just as God had said, had promised. Okay, he wouldn't listen to reason while his child was ill. He said the drastic thing that he will do when we tell him that his child is dead. So when David saw them whispering, he realized that something had happened. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He's dead. Okay, then David got up, washed himself off, put lotion on and changed his clothes, and he went on about his business. Okay, he began to fast, and he began to live his life right for the Lord. He turned from his wicked ways. It's up to God whether he's going to accept you in his kingdom or not. But we, by grace and mercy, by faith, okay, that's how we are able to gain the trust of God. By faith. By faith is how we're supposed to live our life. We trust in God. We lean on him, not on our own understanding. Okay? Now, one of David's giants, or this particular giant that David was facing, was David allowed his flesh to control him, as I had said before. Okay? And that was the giant in his life that he had to face now. Okay, one mistake led to another, and David had to keep covering up his sin with another sin. It's like I said earlier about one lie. Now he's got to cover up one lie with another lie. So now Bathsheba's pregnant. Okay, so now he had to try to get his husband Uriah to go sleep with his own wife. He refused. He had to try to cover up his actions for their actions. Now back then, I guess they didn't have paternity tests or whatever. But it would have been something if the baby came out and looked just like David, huh? They would have known, this baby don't look like me, And so... in today's world, he could have been convicted of premeditated murder in the first degree. And with that penalty, would have come either death or life in prison without the possibility of parole. His sin did convict him, however. It gave him a death sentence. But it wasn't in the material world. It was in God's conviction. His son died. And that was a conviction. See? Now his son had to pay the price for what David did. Son didn't even have a chance to live his life on earth, as I said before, to even be able to know what it was to be born. I mean, he was born and whatnot. He was living, for a little while, maybe a month, not even a month, 10 days or whatever. He wasn't, and then he died. He died because of what his father did. So that's what I was talking about in terms of the children. Now, the children are not going to have to pay the price for what the mama and daddy did. But because the mama and daddy is not doing the right thing and you're sinning, now your child is also going to have to face devils and demons in their lives. Okay? And, they need to be taught how to get, the protection of God. That's why a lot of children are getting killed. I'm not saying that what these people are doing are right. When they're shooting these children up and injuring them and running over them and doing all these kind of things, that's, of course, it's not right. Nobody has a right to take a life but God. However, I believe that if the parent does the right thing, if you humble yourself and you pray before the Lord and you do the right thing, then there's less of a chance of these things happening. My aunt was able to pray over me, and as a result of her prayer, God was provided protection for me against a lot of different things, and I'm still alive today as a result of that. Prayer changes things, as we all know. But when you do wrong in the sight of God, there's so many times when you do wrong, your children are going to get involved in criminal activity or just stuff that's not right, And you're a family, you're a family. You have to act you have to behave as a family. You're together, you live together, you sleep in the same house, you eat at the same table. You can't expect for your child to say, you do what I tell you to do, you live in my house, you know what I mean? And you think that child is going to have any respect for you? No, they're giving you the respect that God commands them to give you, or that you're commanding them to give you, but they don't give you respect because you deserve any respect as a parent, okay? They're giving you respect to keep their mouth shut so they don't get their butt beat, But you have to start trying to train these children up the right way, raise them up a little differently. If you don't know, look on the internet, find out. If you don't want to pay nobody to tell you how to raise your child, look it up on the internet and find out what best way to get a better relationship with your children. And then you'll find out the answer will be right there, Maybe I'll even write a book about that too. But, and I noticed that in a lot, like I said, the first 4 years have helped to stabilize me. So no matter what, my biological mother did, and the rest of the time that I lived with her, it wasn't going to change who I really was inside. And then, of course, the prayer of the righteous, that helped to really seal it with a prayer, seal everything. And the demonic spirit that was in me came out. I remember the night when it happened. I was tossing and turning and everything. She had her hand laid on me. She was praying over me and everything. And I thought I was tossing and turning, and she prayed over me. And I remember the exact moment when the enemy came, when that demonic spirit came up out of me, and it spoke through me to her, laughing and carrying on like it was, it says, I fooled you, and then she wasn't afraid of it, and she slapped her hand back on me, and I could hear I was groaning and moaning and whatnot, but it was the sound of the devil, I swear. If you ever watch The Exorcist, honey, you will, that's almost exactly what had happened that night. She laid her hands on me, and when I woke up that morning, I was so refreshed, but little did I know that was the day that I was set free. Praise God on heaven above. That's the day that all of the demons had left my spirit and they went choked into a pig. Praise the Lord on heaven. So we have to learn how to, be nice and kind to our children too. Our children are people. They're the next generation. They're going to grow up and they're going to be the ones that run the world. They're going to be in city government. They're going to be president of the United States or something. Do you want them to run this world or this city or this council or business, knowing that deep inside that they're a murderer or a criminal or whatever, or that, they're just dysfunctional, or that they don't have the steady or the stable upbringing that they need? Okay, we need to sort of try to change those kind of things, But anyway, David's son died, and he was headed for hell and eternal damnation had he not changed and turned from his wicked ways. You may be able to escape man's justice system, but you will not escape God's justice system. Okay? David tried to cover up his sin at first by having Uriah go home and sleep with his own wife, but Uriah refused to go home that night, so David had him killed. There was also punishment for a woman having a baby out of wedlock back then. Adultery was looked upon as sin punishable by stoning to death. They throw rocks at their victims, stunning them into unconsciousness until they fall faint and die. Okay, again, David covered up that sin with another sin by marrying Bathsheba so that she could have the baby in wedlock when it was actually conceived out of wedlock. But God is the final judge. He looked upon David's act as blasphemous, and his firstborn son died shortly after his birth as punishment for David's sin. Somebody had to pay. sin does not go unpunished. And that's a perfect example of that. Okay, David was king, and his sin was going to be, somebody was going to be held accountable for his sin. David had a problem controlling his flesh, and I believe that since he was king, he thought that he could have anything that he wanted, and anything that he wanted, he could get because he was king. People bowed down to him, they worshiped him like he was God, gave him what he wanted, and that's also idolatry, and idolatry is definitely a sin. And I'm talking about my book, The Champion in You, Win the Battle in the War Against Your Giants, available on Books Galore and More. It will be available on Books Galore and More. And my name is Dr. Sylvia Black, and I have my PhD in Sacred Biblical Studies. Okay, now this is what the Lord had said: because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view, and you did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. Okay, David had sinned against God, and God was very generous to him prior to that, and as a result of that, David got greedy, and then God got angry. Running this Christian race is not an easy one, but you have to decide what's more important to you and what's a priority to you. As I said before, and it's worth reiterating, God gives us all the ability to make choices. We choose life and we choose death, and nobody can make you do anything that you don't want to do. But whatever choice you make, you're going to have to live with the decision that you decide to make, and you're going to have to take responsibility for your actions. My family used to say you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make him drink it, because I was a stubborn child. I wasn't going to do anything I didn't want to do, especially if it meant sinning. I didn't know what a sin was, but I knew that it was wrong in my mind. I'll wash the dishes for you. I'll take out the garbage, but don't ask me to do the unthinkable. Okay, if they shoot me, then I wouldn't be around for them to make me do what they wanted to do. Twisted logic, but that's how stubborn I was. I always believed in a higher power. Now I know it was God. Okay, not quite able to identify him at the time, I should say, but knowing and trusting in that higher power. Anything you do it because you want to do it. Even if you have a gun at your head, you do what they tell you to do because you don't want to get a bullet in your head. Okay, you can choose not to do it, but who's to say whether they're going to pull the trigger or not? Okay, David displeased God with his actions, and what happens when you displease God? Several things could happen. It's up to God what punishment he will render upon you, but do you really want to take that chance and anger God? I don't think so. Anyway, you can get a copy of the book so you can find out more about what happened, and it's right here in The Champion in You, Books Galore and More, available. Actually, The Champion in You, Win the Battle in the War Against Your Giants. And this is going to be found on Books Galore and More, www.booksgaloreandmore. And this book has about 250 pages added. This is an older revision of it. It has about 250 pages, and you will be able to actually get a copy at Books Galore and More. And you can ask you to join me next week right here on Time Warner Public Access TV Channel 20, Wednesday, 6:30 to 7 p.m. and Saturdays from 12:30 p.m. to 1 p.m. And you can also view these videos on YouTube at SBlack3001 and Highway to Heaven Church. I say peace out to you, holla at the sister. I'll see you next week.